This conference will now be recorded.
And then also for a couple of minutes, I'm going to have my video on. I won't have it on the whole time, but just so I can say hello to everybody. I am in Chicago as well. I'm actually in my backyard. It happens to be a gorgeous day today. And oddly enough, the Wi-Fi at my house, the internet connection is like the closest to my patio. So it's kind of nice to be out here. And welcome everybody. So I appreciate you all joining. I hope you find this conversation engaging and interesting. I'm really excited to be doing this. A lot of my workshops and webinars like this are typically done within the confines of a university environment. I'm often engaged by a number of different schools, but because of the environment that we're in and wanting to offer some added services to students and professionals, our team has decided over the course of this summer to be doing webinars that are open and available, and all of you are clearly taking advantage of that. So we're glad to have you. I'm glad to meet everybody, even in our virtual environment. I will introduce myself and give you guys a chance to get to know a little bit about my background, because I think it sets some context for our conversation. And then I'll talk a little bit about our agenda for tonight and then share a few things that I want to have us focus on for the next 90 minutes or so. My name is Pam Schilling, and I am the CEO and founder of Archer Career. I'll tell you guys a little bit, again, in a moment about my career journey. But our firm has evolved. We today consider ourselves to be not only a firm focused on career services, but also we're building career-focused technology, taking a lot of the thought leadership that we've built over many years and bringing that to technology that we can put in the marketplace, make it economical for people to get really high-end and expert-based career coaching. My background, I studied accounting. I went to Booth, Chicago Booth to get my MBA. And then about half of my career was in the technology industry. Half of it was in strategy consulting before I moved into the career coaching space. And I've spent 20 years really coaching individuals in some form or fashion, largely to get jobs in consulting, to succeed in their careers. And I love doing it. I love seeing energetic professionals that want to do great things. And as part of that, I also teach here in Chicago at DePaul University as a professor of management, and bring again a lot of my perspectives and firsthand experience into the classroom. So a couple of other things just as we get started. These webinars were again continuum over the summer. The next couple of ones that we have coming up, if you guys want to register, sign up, participate, the next one we're actually going to talk about case interviews. If those of you that are interested in consulting, that's often one of the really anticipated discussions. Also for individuals that are doing things in the corporate environment or other types of roles, case interviews are very popular these days. That'll be in 2 weeks. And then I'm going to talk about career setbacks in a couple of weeks as well. I think this is a time where individuals are facing career frustration. A lot of students have had internships canceled or shortened or full-time opportunities. So we're going to talk about that and some of the things that you can do to go forward. And then continuing our consulting series at the end of July, we're going to talk about why you, which is a combination of what are the skills and experiences that you need to have, and then also, is this the right career path for you? So just some continuation, and those are always on our website, just like you signed up for this event. And then for all of you, I also have what I think is kind of a fun special opportunity. So we're getting ready to launch one of our software applications. It's focused on case prep. What we're hoping to do is give you all a chance to be a part of the beta software that's coming out. And so if you are interested in that, go to our webpage under technology, there's a form. And by attending the webinar, we're going to give everyone as a gift for helping us work through our beta 1 month of access. So just click on the drop down and say that you attended a webinar. And probably our launch is planned for the end of August, early September. So under works, we're super excited about it. And then the final thing I've also been doing because of this unusual environment is that I've changed some aspects of my coaching. I'm doing this for a very, very nominal fee. And then 100% of that fee I have been donating. Up to this point, I donated it to a local business. Our team is now thinking about where we might be donating for the remainder of the summer. And it's just something as a business, we're very fortunate. Our environment has stayed strong in this environment. So we want to give back to those that may be struggling. So if that's something you're interested in, you can sign up through our website as well. So enough of those kind of logistics and some other opportunities that we wanted to share with you. So tonight, I'm going to talk about why consulting. And I'm going to take this from a couple of different angles. So one is the business side of consulting and why consulting as a profession exists. The other angle is why you might want to be a consultant and what it means for your career. You may have already thought about this, and that is great. But sometimes having some really good deep reflection on this is beneficial, especially in the interview process. Then I'm also going to talk a little bit about the entry points. So I think we have a fairly diverse group. And as a point of reference for me, I would love if those of you on live could put in the chat, are you currently a student? And if so, an undergrad, an MBA, or an advanced degree? So student and what type? And then if you're an experienced professional, so you're not currently a student, maybe how many years of work experience you have. And of course, if you're a part-time student, you can pick which of those categories you want to be in. So that'll help me just to make sure I reconcile a little bit of my perspective and keep my comments as relevant to all of you as possible. So we're going to talk about, and the reason that's helpful is that there are multiple entry points into consulting. So I want to share that. And then I'm going to make a few comments about getting a consulting job. I'm not going to go into that deeply in this conversation. We'll be doing that in subsequent webinars, but I want to touch upon those elements because I think it matters as you think about this job. And then the final thing I want to talk a little bit about is the exit path and where the consulting role ends you up or has the potential to end you up. Along that way, I'm going to share with all of you some of my personal experiences because probably more so than a lot of career coaches, I have been in multiple types of roles. I recruited and interviewed for consulting at 3 different phases of my career. As I look back, I had consulting jobs even though I didn't hold that title. And then I've also been a recruiter. So there's some of that I think is again useful to help share some of the insights about this career opportunity with all of you. And then again, along the way, please put your questions in the chat. I'll take some questions as we go. And then I'm going to make sure I try to leave some time at the end for really just open Q&A. Nothing is off limits. Well, maybe a few things are off limits, but I'll judge that based on your question. So let's go back to the beginning. And I think this is actually very important. Why consulting and understanding the role of consultants Why do I care so much about this question? Probably the most dominant reason is that when I was on the recruiting side and at every one of my consulting firms, I either led the recruiting team or was part of it on the campuses where I was most affiliated with. I would ask that question at networking events of students. And I would say a good 60, 70% of the time, the answer that I got was not fully thought through. It did not have depth to it. And as I observed this and thought about it, I think it's somewhat because not everybody fully understands the job of a consultant. It sounds interesting. It has some really exciting aspects to it. It feels like a fast track in some ways for your career. And all those things are true. But after doing it for more than 10 years, now that I have colleagues and classmates of mine who are partners at consulting firms, I think I have this more holistic view. And so the things that I think you all want to think about in this consulting space. So one, there are different types of consultants, and that's very important to understand. And there are layers. There are lots of different types of consultants. Generally, when people think about consulting, it's either the individuals that are sitting at the highest levels of the companies, thinking about these big picture plans, thinking about what the C-suite is most concerned about, and really dealing with the executive team. There are consultants at every level of the organization, and those consultants have a tremendous amount of value to the company. They could be technology focused, they could be process focused, they could be focused on a particular functional area like finance or supply chain or HR. All of those are consulting roles, but we tend to think about consulting in layers. There's strategy consulting, there's maybe a broad category of management consulting, there's specialty consulting, et cetera, et cetera. So it's important to understand that consulting is an industry and it's a role, and having a perspective on that will help you. But in general, if I link a lot of this together, the primary value that consultants bring to companies, it's being a trusted advisor, because if you're an executive, you need someone who is reasonably objective, because sometimes the people within the organization are not. That's just the reality. You also need people who are going to come in and very specifically hone in on a business problem that you're facing and come up with some type of solution, ideally one that's very creative and allows you to move ahead in some way. Also, there are problems that companies have that expertise might not be held within their own organization, or maybe there are some embedded ways of thinking that the company's having trouble getting unstuck. And the fact of the matter is, even large companies don't have every single expertise in-house. So go to people that are experts. There are times when executives just need to get a fresh perspective. They may be very embedded in their industry. They may not have perspective outside of their industry. And sometimes the best ideas get borrowed from other businesses or other industries. There used to be this, kind of cliche saying, Southwest Airlines never benchmark themselves against another airline because all airlines are terrible. Why would you benchmark yourself against other businesses that are suboptimal? So they would benchmark themselves against Indy 500 pit crews in terms of the turnaround time for airplanes at gates. That's the fresh perspective that sometimes an outsider has. And then it's also true that, consultants are generally super smart people. That's part of the hiring. Some executives just want to hire really smart people who think with this agility and analytically, and they like kind of having those smarts in the room. There's good and bad to that, by the way, but there's a value for this. And when you all think about this value, one of the equations that I used to share with the junior consultants that I worked with, whatever your salary is, the client pays 3 to 5 times that for you. But then their expectations are even higher than that, because you should deliver more value than what they're paying for in their fees. So when you all think about the value, ideally, this is ideally and theoretically, that a consultant brings, it should be 4 to 5 times what the consulting fees are. And if you look at firms, some of the firms, they even talk about this on their websites. They will cite that value equation. Some are more direct about it, but this is an important part of this profession. It also represents why this profession is so intense. And that's something to keep in mind as well. So for a second, I want to give you guys a little bit of my career journey, because I think it demonstrates a lot of principles about the consulting path. So I've been working ever since I was a young kid. My mom always worked for small companies. I worked for them. Over the summers, I worked at the trash company, I worked at a computer school, and I worked for a rag company. Those are important formative experiences. And then when I was in high school, I worked at an amusement park and I worked at a summer camp. So those things are also really formative, because I had a lot of leadership opportunity. I got to see how businesses were run. My jobs weren't super sexy, but they always had problems. Like my summer at the amusement park, I was in a retail store, and every time there was some kind of major thing going on, our t-shirts would go haywire. And I spent the summer trying to figure out how I didn't have to spend 16 hours a day folding t-shirts. That's a consulting mindset. When I was a college student, my summer internship was actually at the US General Accountability Office. Doesn't that sound fancy? And they're essentially the auditors for the US government. I thought it was an accounting internship. I was really wrong. And what I ended up doing over the summer was 2 consulting projects. One had to do with the census that went on and trying to figure out if the follow-up to the traditional census was being conducted properly. The second had to do with land acquisition by the US Army and trying to understand choices and scenarios for one of the major infantry divisions of the US Army who had run out of literally space for training. So I had no idea, but everything that I did, quite honestly, before I was a senior in college was a consulting job. It wasn't in that title, but the kind of work, it was problem solving. So I was fortunate to have that internship. And what it led to was me getting my first job at Sprint. And in that job, I thought, again, I was going into an accounting related job because that was my major. But Sprint was transforming its internal audit group into an internal consulting organization. So we did operational consulting across the title or across the company without that title. It was very fascinating because I had a chance to work with executives. I had a chance to understand how the pieces of the company sat together. I had a chance to think about how the competitors in the telecom space were all dealing with each other. So without the title, I still was doing project-related work and always trying to understand how they connected to the larger enterprise. And, in the world of, kind of wacky and fun things, I spent a year working for a company called Worldcom. I'm curious, anybody on the chat know why Worldcom is so famous? What do you guys think? It's corporate history trivia. Maybe famous is the bad word. Maybe it's infamous. Ah, yes. Yes. Fraud is probably, yes, accounting scandals. So at Worldcom was found to have committed the largest corporate fraud ever. Fortunately, I left a little bit before that occurred. But as a business person, I have a lot of perspective. It happened and what led to, and on somewhat watched how strategy is fragile, and WorldCom had a strategy that was fragile. That I think, again, consulting, you also do. So I also do postmortems. So I was very fortunate to have had those experiences. Got an MBA at Chicago Booth, the University of Chicago, and then I spent the next 8 years of my career mostly in consulting, but also with a stint at a pre-IPO tech company. And this is important because I had a chance to interview as an MBA student, I had a chance to interview MBAs, and also I had a chance to interview as an experienced hire. So there's more than one way to get into consulting firms. That's the bottom line. And then the rest of it is, for our purposes, my own career journey sort of has a later relevance. But I took an opportunity to come back to the business school at Chicago Booth and work in their career office. And that gave me a lot of perspective on some of the kind of inner workings of consulting recruiting. Then that led to essentially my career today, which is really much more like an entrepreneur. So some of that I tell you all because you can go in and out of consulting. Consulting builds, it has certain aspects to it, but I think when I think back for myself, a lot of it has to do with the confidence that I built and also the many, many iterations of dealing with highly ambiguous business decisions and trying to figure out how to make choices that are going to allow an organization to live and breathe, sustain, drive profitability, drive good, all of those things. How's the sound? I know there was a note to me that it's cutting out. Hopefully it's a little bit better. Thank you. So as a consultant, I was a generalist. That I think is not the intention of my career. I had actually intended to really leverage my technology chops, but I ended up working across diverse industries: airlines, retail, public transportation, logistics, some interesting things. I worked on an Olympic bid at some point. And all of those experiences, force you to be very nimble, to be very creative, to learn about different leadership and management styles. So the question, why consulting? I think one of the things you all should ask yourself is, why might you want to go into this role? And before I got to this place, I had some very clear perspectives. And this is something that I think helps you, especially in the recruiting process. So for me, because I was going into a true consulting role post business school, I had a little bit of work experience. So for those of you that are undergrads, it might come from a different place. But those of you that have a little bit of work experience, for me, there were two driving factors for why consulting. One had to do with that I had always spent my career in one industry, telecom, and I worked for the number 3 player. And I felt that as a business leader, perhaps I was not getting insight about what it took to run a world-class organization, to run a market leader. And for me, consulting was a pathway to do that and to diversify my industry exposure. The second rationale was that I had worked with consultants while I was at Sprint, and I saw their ability to influence. And it was very different than what I was able to do. And pretty simply, I wanted to play on that team. So when I talked to consulting firms, I talked about those points. Now, you all may know that consulting is a beneficial way to build your career. That was certainly a third motivation. If I was going to move forward, if I was going to be ambitious, if I wanted to be at a C level at some point, that was also in the back of my mind. But I probably put that as a third priority. And that's, I think, something to have a perspective on, because consulting firms want to know that you want to come in and do good things for your clients. Now, the more junior you are, the more they expect that you're going to be probably getting more absorption in terms of your career development. But those of you that are at more of the MBA level, perhaps even the advanced degree level, and certainly those that are experienced hires, there's a lot of contribution that you're making to the client work. So this question again of why consulting, it's kind of this mixture of why it is that you want to do that consulting work that adds a lot of value, and then also what is your thesis about why it makes sense in the context of your own career journey. So for me, now what I did over the years, I'm involved in recruiting, I'm involved in MBA career services, I'm working with so many people, I see resumes, I see people in the interview process. As a consultant, I'm trying to assess and design patterns and programs that really help break this down, because I think that for some people, the consulting process is perhaps a little bit out of reach, or it's unclear how you get there, right? Well, that's a little bit of the reverse engineering that I've tried to do. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that, first starting with entry points and then starting with getting the job. So there are typically 3 entry points into consulting. One is at the undergrad level, and you can start as an intern or you can go in as a full-time hire. Secondly, you can go in as a graduate student, and there are direct MBA routes, and then for anyone who has an advanced degree. Advanced degrees are master's degrees, JDs, MBA or MDs, and then any type of doctoral degree. Probably the bulk of the hiring is done at the MBA level. Just to be clear about that for most consulting firms. And then the third pathway is for experienced hires. And an experienced hire is essentially anyone who's not a student. So you could be 2 or 3 years out of undergrad, you've developed some expertise or some skill set that is relevant to consulting, and you have an opportunity to be hired in at one of the more junior levels. You'll be a little bit more advanced than where the undergrads come in, but you won't necessarily be as far as an MBA. The other opportunity for experienced hires is if you have an MBA or an advanced degree, and then maybe you worked a year or 2 as after graduating, and then you go and you interview later in your career history. And people nowadays may have 5 years of post-MBA experience, may have 10 years, may have 15 years. The growth in hiring for consulting firms has been at the experienced hire level. I did an analysis last year, and I compared hiring by consulting firms out of, well, I looked at Chicago Booth because it's my alma mater, compared the number of consulting hires out out of the MBA program in 2000 versus 2000 and let's say 18, class of 2018. The numbers had not changed. So in some ways, there is a fixed amount of hiring that occurs at the MBA level. So if the firms are then growing, and because they are a consulting firm, a services firm, unless they build robots to do consulting, which, you know, that may be a trend in the future. But for the most part, their manufacturing facility is people. So if you want to deliver more client work, you have to have more people. If you have a fixed number of MBAs, then the people, that extra need for people comes out of perhaps undergrad programs, but more likely experienced hire. And I think you would see that trend. So that is something that's an important consideration. So all of you joining me tonight, you come from these really diverse backgrounds. And it's a great opportunity to, if you're very early in your career, to just have some reflection that this is a place, a career pathway that you can enter in at multiple phases. And then for those of you that are sort of post-education, it's also a place that you can join if you have relevant skills. So I'm going to take a pause, and if you all have any questions about what I've talked about to this point, I'm happy to address those. Feel free to put them in the chat, or I'm also going to take everybody off mute. Any questions at this point? Excellent. Well, the analysis. So there's a question if the analysis I spoke of is available to read. I will see if it's in a format that I can easily publish. It's probably in one of my PowerPoint slides. But yeah, I'll see if I can put that. So normally when I have these webinars, I'll put the webinar recording link and then I'll put some other resources. So I'll make a note of that. You guys, I can tell, analysis, I should have known. We talk about that and everybody gets excited. Other questions? All right. So let me speak then a little bit about getting the consulting job. And again, I'm not going to go into too much depth here. I'm going to have some subsequent webinars, and a few of my colleagues are as well, and to shed light on this. But I think it's important to note, and let me tell you all kind of a couple anecdotes that I think make this extremely important. I have several friends that are recruiters inside consulting firms. We chat, you know, we know what we do, and each of us, you know, has insights into this process. There's nothing more frustrating to a recruiter than having talked to a candidate for 3-4 months. That person, you know, has got it, has a sharpness. And for some reason, you show up for the day of the interview and it's just not on, and you don't progress through that phase or don't receive an offer. Believe it or not, that's super frustrating. The consulting recruiters want everyone to do well because it really helps the firms, because they need people. Another data point, and you all may recognize this, the annual turnover for most consulting firms is about 25%. So 1 of every 4 people is leaving. That is a function of some individuals choosing to leave and some individuals being asked to leave. So many consulting firms have what's known as an up or out policy, which means if you're not promotable to the next level based on your performance, they will some firms call it counseling out, some firms call it a transition, but they will not keep you in your current role at your current level forever. Different firms have different approaches to this. That is not always the case. I have a client of mine right now who is a current consultant. This individual is not in an up or out role. Frankly, they could stay at the level that they're at until they retire from the firm. So, there are different circumstances. But if you come back to this, 25% of people are leaving every year. Probably half of those people are quote counseled out. The other half leave of their own choice, whether it's the lifestyle, whether it's a new opportunity that's really interesting. So the recruiters need you to be successful. The consultants that are interviewing you want you to be successful. Believe it or not, they're actually rooting for you. But sometimes that preparation falls short. And the other comment that I will make, because of the work that I do today, I have a chance to work with different business schools, different universities. There are different cultures of preparation for consulting. Some schools have enormous infrastructure to prepare you for consulting. At some of the major MBA programs, the top, say, 10, they're often putting 25, 30, 35% of the MBA class into consulting jobs. I'm here in Chicago. I, naturally do some work with the business schools located here. Both of those schools have very high placement rates into consulting. That means that they have a lot of infrastructure and a culture where second year students help first year students and alumni help students. And there is perhaps even a competitiveness among students. There's good and bad of that, but there's, conversations while having coffee. Have you done your cases? How many cases have you done? So this is a culture, especially within the large universities that are target schools of firms. And what that means is that if you're a target school, they're actively recruiting. They tend to be hiring multiple students from your campus. Sometimes at schools that don't have that placement in consulting, are not a target school, that culture of preparation may not be there. The peer, both the peer support and the peer pressure don't necessarily exist. And then finally, in the experienced hire environment, usually what happens is that the interview comes up very quickly. We tend to be overly optimistic. If you read anything about psychology, most of us are very optimistic individuals, and we think we are better prepared than we actually are. A colleague of mine who is an experienced hire recruiter shared with me that in the last 6 months, fewer than 50% of the experienced hire candidates received offers. That is not a good equation. I'm a finance person. Originally, that's not math. That's not a value proposition that is economically viable for anybody. So how do you get sort of better, sharper at this? Some of it is, if this is the path that you want to go down, getting educated about what it takes. I often speak about the height of the bar to get a consulting offer, which is incredibly high. It's harder than you think. It's incredibly competitive, and name the firm, it's extremely competitive. So these elements that I'm showing you all on the screen tend to be the main things that need to be done. So networking to build your knowledge of the firm and unique attributes of a firm. Also, consulting is a relationship-driven business. People need to say to themselves, I would staff you on my project. That's the extent of the relationship. Because I know what it takes And if I'm, in rough seas in a boat and I have to navigate things, I want people who can help me navigate that and, align with the team and row just as hard as everybody else. So the way that you establish that relationship is through networking, and it builds your knowledge about that firm along with what would be secondary research, which is going online and looking at the firm's websites and how they talk about their client work and understanding why it is that, they hire certain types of candidates, what's the profile. And your goal with networking and research is to be able to clearly say why you want to be a consultant and why you want to work at that firm. And believe it or not, I've had individuals that unfortunately went through the process, even MBAs at some of the best schools around, who received no offers at the end of a recruiting cycle. And one individual in particular was told that they did not answer the why you want to work for our firm question well at all. And they were told that by several different people. So this is not something that's unique to one particular firm. So that's an enormous kind of important part of this process. And for every one of you, no matter where you are in your process, if for our undergrads listening and joining us, this is something you could start in your first or second year. People enjoy networking. Believe it or not, I still love networking. I do a ton of it, but it's different today. But when I was a consultant, I loved talking to young people because you were going to be someone that I might hire. That's really important. If you're an MBA student, the sooner you start, the better. If you're an experienced hire, start it tomorrow. You can never, do too much research. You might over network a little bit, and that's something to be aware of. But most people don't have that problem, believe it or not. So once you've kind of got those things in motion, then you're going to build what are the typical job search tools, how you're going to introduce yourself, your resume. The resume is crucial. And I have a couple of webinars that I've already done on resumes, and I'll probably continue to do them. The cool thing about your resume is that you can write it with consulting language. Most of you have worked on projects. Many of you have even done, 8, 10, 12-week kind of special projects that are almost like consulting engagements. Many undergraduate students these days are doing class projects or experiential learning that are mini consulting projects. So tailoring that resume, it becomes easy if you think about your work in the context of a project base. And then you'll write really good cover letters. You'll have your LinkedIn profile, which will help with your networking, by the way. And you get those tools put in place. And then the final piece is what things you need to be ready for the interview. So the two pieces, the case and the experience interview, are both equally important. It is well known for those that have gone down this path that most of the consulting firms, it's an equal balance in terms of an offer decision. You have to do well at your case interview. You also have to do well at your experience interview. How the firms deploy that differs firm by firm. If you set your sights on firms, for example, such as McKinsey, it is 100% a 50-50 balance, meaning every interview, they're expecting you to succeed on both of those dimensions. So the prep and the practice are valuable. Something that I think helps on the case front is that there are so many everyday issues that you can think about. You don't have to formally practice cases to get ready for case interviews, especially if you're early. But I think one of the things when you all are maybe asking yourself is consulting right for me? Why do I want to be a consultant? Ask yourself if you're constantly walking around solving problems. And I think that there is an an orientation to how consultants think. It's a combination of wanting to solve problems and being able to make decisions for direction without comprehensive data. And that's a mindset, and that's sort of a personality. So practicing that and getting really good insights. And by the way, the junior professionals oftentimes have really good insights because you're very instinctive. Sometimes experienced hires, the instincts have been overshadowed by your practical experience. You've seen it, you've done it. So those are ends of the spectrum to have awareness of, because they can interfere sometimes in the way that you think on the case side. And then the final aspect of it on the experience interview, really when you get down to it, a lot of diverse experiences are fantastic for discussing in interviews. I mean, I used to think about things that I did outside of my work environment, or challenges that I had as a student, or things that had occurred in my travels. So wherever you are in this process, one of the things that I often recommend as you're thinking again about why consulting is this inventory of your experiences. And at multiple phases of your kind of personal, professional history, because, if you're an undergrad student, things you did in high school might still be relevant. If you've been out of school for a couple of years, the things you've done in your work plus your undergrad time are probably relevant. As you move forward, you're trying to keep perspective on maybe the things that have occurred within the last 5 years. And I was very fortunate when I interviewed for consulting roles as an MBA student, because my job at Sprint 7 years earlier, I had been in a leadership rotational program, and we were required to keep a log of all of our projects. So I actually had a folder. So especially for young professionals, think about keeping a log of the types of things that you've done, the projects you've worked on, different experiences you've had. If you're a little bit more, along in your career, then it's nice to stop and take stock in what you've done and make an inventory of those experiences, because it will make a significant difference in how you tell your stories and how robust they are. So the final thing that I would say about the consulting job search is that it can take time. Most people I work with, it takes about 16 weeks. It can take less, it can take more. It just depends on where you are. The important thing is to know the hiring cycles of the firms. So generally for undergrads, for internships, they're probably coming early fall. Maybe the same for full-time. There might be opportunities with boutique firms or firms that do small numbers of hiring. Those might occur in the spring for internships and full-time. And then, the big difference with MBAs is typically the internship process occurs in January. Full-time usually is October, depends on the geography. And then for experienced hiring, it's going on consistently. There's no exact timeline, but I think the way that you can manage your timeline is, if you apply and you are a strong candidate and you have had conversations, so you've got either some type of a referral or a recruiter is advocating for you, by the time you apply, you're probably going to interview 2, 3, 4 weeks later. This means you need to be ready. And some of the firms will let you extend that, but that isn't necessarily a best practice in asking for more time. It also puts you under the gun to have to prepare under high stress conditions. So if you're thinking about the experienced hire route, then you have to almost plan your own timeline. And it takes a little bit of time to get things synced up. I mean, I've seen people prepare in 8 weeks. I've seen people take 6 months. Just very much depends. The bottom line is to have your own project plan. And, you know, if you're thinking about the fall process right now, mid-June, it's a good time to start getting ready. We can have a later conversation if the fall looks like there will be recruiting happening, but independent of our current kind of present economic environment, this is a good time for most people to begin that prep process. So the last couple things that I want to talk about are the exit path. And having some assessment of what consulting means for you in your journey. So back to this question of why consulting. Some people are consultants forever. That is a small number. Most of the data says that fewer than 10% of consultants hired make partner. It's a pyramid, so that makes sense. Most people stay 2 years. For post MBA consulting roles, 2 years is about the manager point, and some people just don't want the manager role. For undergrads, at some of the firms, there's a natural exit at 2, 3, 4 years with some support to go to business school. Some people feel at 2 years that they've got a robust enough experience and there's something more to do. One of the things I think that really helps is if you have some ideas of where you're heading. So the more experienced you are, the more clarity you should have about this. So there's two sides of this question of why consulting and what does it mean for your future. Side number one is, what are the things that consultants go to do? The other side of the coin is, what is it that you want to do professionally? And making sure that those things are in sync matters. Now, the good thing is consulting is a profession that leads to many, many, many career paths. And I am not alone. I think my career path has been sort of zigzagged, although I can now almost, draw a straight line through those zigzags. But consulting led me into higher education as both an academic and in the career office, and then ultimately led me to be an entrepreneur, a startup founder. All of these job titles, going into a chief of staff job. I have a former consulting colleague of mine who is the CEO of a charter school. People go into executive search. They go into venture capital. They take corporate roles. There are roles in product management, hedge funds. So going back into financial services, going into private equity and venture capital. All of that is possible. So there are so many options. That is a good thing. But part of it too is, what do you want to do? And where I think individuals find it challenging in the consulting job is that because you are working so many muscles, if you haven't been thoughtful about managing your career as a consultant, you can limit those options because either your work has gotten very specialized or you've become kind of jack of all trades, master of none, and then really your only option is to go do strategic planning. So this idea of having some thinking about your future goals, wherever you are in your career journey, even young professionals, it guides you. So as an example, I can give you all a few examples, but my last consulting engagement when I was at Strategy I was working on some human capital initiatives and problems. Probably problems is the better way to say it. And part of it was a human capital transformation. That part of the project was intellectually very interesting. It was possibly one of the most complex things I've ever done. The analysis that I had to do for our client was unbelievable. Super, super fun. But it wasn't necessarily, when I was starting to think about leaving consulting, it wasn't necessarily in the sweet spot of where I saw my future. And so when I was on that engagement, there was a kind of special initiative that the president of the division that we were working for wanted some insight on. And it was around building a high performing workforce and doing a benchmark analysis of leading companies and who would be their peer group that they should aspire to. So I rose my hand, I volunteered to do that. I knew that my future post consulting had something to do with human capital. I didn't want to do transformation, but I loved this idea of high performing workforces. So I volunteered to do it and I got to do a project like that. So these are the things that when you have some ideas about your future direction, they make a difference. I have a good, friend of mine who post business school ended up at McKinsey. At some point in his career, he had been a teacher many, many, many years before business school. And one of the things that he did when he went to McKinsey is that, so he wanted to diversify his background, but he also internally networked with their kind of ed tech experts. And same kind of thing, every now and then when a project would come up, he raised his hand, and that allowed him to get some ed tech experience so that when he was to think about potentially post roles, he would have some of that experience on his resume. So again, having hypotheses about this, some people are very, very certain, and it's okay to have uncertainty, but having a hypothesis is better than just saying I'll do just about anything. Although I will tell you guys, as a new consultant, doing just about anything is fantastic because you may get a chance to work on some projects that are super cool and super amazing. So these pieces, what I want to kind of summarize at this point, and then I'll entertain any questions that people have. There's thinking about why you want to go down this path in the first place, given where you are and what stage you are in your career. Then there's also thinking about, well, how are you going to get there? And what aspects of your background might you be able to leverage, again, wherever you are in your career journey? But then also foreshadowing a little bit of where do you want to be post consulting. You can always stay as a consultant and continue that path to partner, but it's valuable to be thinking a little bit in the future. And one of the things that consultants like to talk about in the networking conversations is what is it as a business professional that you want to impact? And so when you can say, hey, in the future, I'm really excited about healthcare. I'm really excited about telemedicine, or I'm really excited about issues of literacy in emerging markets, and I want to be in a position someday to know how to run a global organization that focuses on that. So those are really exciting things when you're thinking about the tactics of the job search to go through and brainstorm. And then when you get interested in consulting and have those networking conversations, that's the kind of conversation that we on the recruiting side as consultants want to have with you, as opposed to, okay, here's the 3 things that you need to do to prepare for interviews. There's so much information in the marketplace about how to prepare. We much more are interested in kind of talking about the way as business people that we can make big impacts and how to move mountains. And so I encourage you to think about all 3 aspects as you embark potentially on this path, or if you're already on that path. All right. So I have a few questions that were submitted, but I'm interested in what questions you guys might have at this stage. And again, anything is fair game. Most anything I'll share with you if I don't think it's fair game. But please ask any questions, take yourself off mute if you'd like to ask live. Otherwise, use the chat for questions, please. All right, so I'm reading a question. So for experienced hires, what level of position would be the entry point into a firm? And could you give an example of the job title? So a couple thoughts about experienced hire. It is somewhat dependent upon where you are in your career journey. And it is also somewhat dependent on the hiring strategies of the firms. And, if I say it this way, if some of you have done research about consulting firms, it's almost like schools and programs. They're kind of ranked, if you will. There's a vault, top 50, et cetera, et cetera. So the higher the ranking the consulting firm, if you allow me to use that language, they are ultimately more conservative in where they will bring you in as an experienced hire. And this is true at any level. So if you have 2 years of professional experience or you have 15 years of professional experience, the higher ranking, if you will, of the firm, typically they're going to be more conservative in bringing you in. And some firms have a very standard policy that they bring every new person in at the same level, who's kind of the same background. So if you have an undergrad degree or you have 2 or 3 years of work experience, you're probably going to come in as a business analyst. If you have 10 years of experience post MBA, and you might go in as an associate, the same as an MBA. Other firms, what they will do is they will calibrate your salary, but they might bring you in at a more junior title. Some examples of this. So typically McKinsey will, and there are exceptions, but typically they'll bring people in as an associate, regardless of your years of experience. There are specialty roles at McKinsey. They now have a very large implementation practice. Those have different titles. As a comparison, a firm like a Deloitte or Ernst & Young, they might bring in someone with 10 years of experience as a manager. And some of that has to do with the fact that in those firms, when you are holding a manager title, you have certain business development expectations. And if you've never done consulting business development, they don't want this to be your first time. And if you don't meet those business development requirements, you might find yourself being asked to leave. Other firms, it just depends. I mean, I went to Strategy and as an experienced hire. I was a director at my prior firm, which was Huron Consulting Group. Strategy and they were very open with me. They did not consider Huron a peer, and therefore they would not bring me in at the equal level. They brought me in one level lower, and the deal was, if you would, the negotiation was that I would work 6 months at that level, really 2 or 3 engagements, and then I would, receive a promotion at that stage. That did not quite transpire, which is a little bit why experienced hire recruiting is challenging. Okay. So I often advise people somewhat, you have to think about the job versus the title, because most often in consulting, except at the partner level, the job's going to be good. And financially, it's going to be good. And if it's the title that's kind of getting you hung up, I would maybe make that secondary. If the salary is better, and even in my situation, when I moved firms, even though the title was kind of at the level lower, I received a fairly large pay increase. So go firm by firm, and there are some firms that they will take your experience and they align it, and it's at that level. But just be aware that consulting firms, they will be conservative in general, because if you have no consulting experience, they're going to be extra conservative. If you come from another consulting firm, there's a few things that they kind of think you have to unlearn and relearn, and you don't know how they operate, right? And I mean, this is a 90% generalization. There are always people that find their way and are able to kind of move up a title, but I find that happens more as an exception than a rule. Okay, and I'm happy to follow up on that if you want some further insight. So there's another question: does your college major matter when it comes to becoming a consultant? Is it necessary to major in something business finance to become a consultant? Excellent question. Excellent question. I think my experience has been, and I think the consulting firms would say this, that for the most part, your major doesn't matter. The work you've done as a student matters. So you could be an English major, but you've taken a few business courses. You could be a psychology major, and it just so happens that your thing is statistics, or a biology major. It shouldn't matter. And even for people who go on to get advanced degrees, the consulting firms, and so you're doing a doctorate very deeply in one area of study. People who have curiosity and who can translate their skill set. And consulting firms will hire philosophy majors, English majors. I have a friend who was in theater before business school, like he was an actor. That may say something about consulting. You guys can determine that. So per se, I don't think the major matters. But I think what does matter is your extracurricular, co-curricular, your electives, and some of the other experiences that you get. And so the resume, the rounded outness of your resume matters. And I think also the business finance background isn't a shoe-in. Finance degrees are fantastic. I studied accounting personally. I'm really glad that I did that because I have a very good understanding of how financial statements work and what drives earnings per share. But not all business majors kind of have the big perspective that is necessary for consulting. So if I was, for any of you that are in an academic program right now, I believe that this is the case, and you guys are welcome to test this. Talk to as many consultants as you possibly can. They will tell you, study something that you really love and do well at it, and then round yourself out in other ways. So if you're, again, even at a liberal arts university, in the humanities or in the sciences or in engineering or business or nursing, it doesn't matter. Teaching, as an anecdote, Teach for America alumni are among the most highly sought out individuals by consulting firms. You guys can think about that for a second and the implication of that. But study and do well, and then how do you add these skills and perspectives? So shadow people, do internships, do experiential learning projects. If you have a chance to take a course by Training the Street to get financial modeling, that's fantastic. If you have a chance to learn Python and Java and get some of the technical skills, you may not fully use it on the job, but it rounds you out. If you have a chance to be the president of a student group, if you have a chance to create a student group, that portfolio matters. And then that's for undergrad, but even for MBA students, even for experienced hires, having a well-rounded portfolio is extremely valuable. Okay, so I hope that gives you some perspective on that. And again, if there's more I can add to it, please let me know. So there's a question about a particular firm mentioned, IBM, and the student recruiting cycle is very long. Lots of coffee chats, lots of networking, interviews. Oh, good question. Do I think this is going to change with our focus right now because of COVID and social distancing? So this is a great question, and I don't have a precise answer. I think what I would tell all of you is, for the fall, I think it's a little bit uncertain, and it also depends on the firm and the school. For campus type recruiting, I don't know how, I mean, certainly the in-person activities are going to be difficult depending on where you are. I was on the phone today with a colleague of mine at one of the career offices, and he shared that they won't be doing any on-campus networking events. They will be doing on-campus interviewing, and it has to do with the size of the crowd. So the schools, the career offices, are trying to understand how to do virtual networking that's facilitated. To my understanding, many of the firms are doing webinars, and I think they'll continue to do that for a while. And I think all of us have an opportunity to witness history in the making. And if this changes the way that firms recruit, what I have a hypothesis about, and I'm excited to see if this comes true, I believe that this environment, and this is just Pam's personal opinion, I think this environment that we're in has opened people's minds to being able to tap into new candidates. The opportunity to do virtual interviews and to now tap into many more campuses because you don't have to fly there, I think is huge. The ability to network with people no matter where they are, frankly, in the world, is huge. And the firms, have been thrown into a situation where they have to do virtual interviews. And so because a lot of hiring and recruiting is just conservative by nature, well, rather than kind of thinking about, well, how do we do this and should we pilot it, everybody got thrown into the super ice cold swimming pool, and they just have had to do virtual interviews and virtual internships and all of those things. So I'm optimistic for all of you that this will happen. And then I think the final thing I would say about it is I encourage all of you to test this. So reaching out to people, asking for a networking session. I still have coffee chats. It's just I make the coffee in my home coffee pot. The person on the other end has also made coffee. We joke about what type of coffee we're drinking. And it allows that to happen. Now, the final thing about your question is about this long cycle. I don't know if that will change. That is something, and I was speaking to a couple of individuals on our team. We have a couple of summer interns working with us this summer, and I'm constantly reminded at how companies don't have the best practices when it comes to these interview cycles. The only thing I can tell all of you is be patient. Be assertive but patient. And some firms are really good about it. They have, let's say, they might do recruiting for 2 or 3 months, and then they have an application period, and then the interview process takes like 3 weeks. That other firms are much less tight than that. And then some firms it's even faster. So you have to, I think, calibrate a little bit of your expectation. But I think we all have to anticipate, at least for the short term, that this process is just going to work a little bit differently. So I don't know if that's comforting or continues to be challenging. I would like to say that there's purpose behind these recruiting processes. I do think that the firms have always had significant financial resources to be able to do a lot of recruiting activities, and so therefore they have. And I think they believe that it shows motivation on your part. It gives them a chance to get to know you in multiple environments. It gets a chance to see your stamina. But I also could just, be a little bit crazy, and maybe they just, do it because no one's ever challenged it. So there's a question about decrease in hiring. Again, I think you all should be optimistic unless otherwise. I've been talking to a lot of my clients who I work with one-on-one, because normally, as someone in my work, I want to be super optimistic. I want to, give you the pep talk and say, look, you might not be from a target school, but you have what it takes. Or, you're at a target school and maybe you don't have the ideal profile, but you have what it takes. Like, I like to be very hard charging. And a lot of that is because somebody told me one day, way back when, that I didn't have what it took to be a consultant. And that just irritated me. So I proved him wrong. What you guys need to think about is play to your strengths and pursue these opportunities, and let the let the cards fall where they will, because no preparation for a job in consulting is wasted. Because if that role's not there, the next opportunity is, and you tend to be better prepared than a lot of other candidates. And then in addition, if it's not this year, it'd be next year. So that high level of preparation that you need to have for consulting, it serves you well in your job search over the long run. In specifics around hiring next year, so no recession has really lasted more than 18 months. Consulting firms are usually looking out a year or two when they're doing their hiring. The difference in this recession versus the last one, and some of you may have some of that memory, others, it may not have been on your radar, but when we went into the last recession, 2008, 2009, people were really blind to it. And so they were in hyper growth mode, hiring, and then all of a sudden, this massive recession hit, and it happened quick and it happened deep. This recession, although stimulated by a different factor, most organizations, and especially consulting firms, were gearing up for a recession. We've had 10 years of economic growth. About every 10 years, there's a recession. And so I think the consulting firms, and I have colleagues that we had this discussion, they were kind of building their force shields to get ready for a recession. And at the same time, they've been growing. So it puts the consulting firms in this recession in a much healthier position than they were in the 2008, 2009, and then also back in the 2000, 2001 recessions. So I think that means they're going to probably continue a sustainable level of hiring. And then specifically what they do, it just depends a little bit on how our health/economic situation occurs. But most everybody I know that's working as a consultant right now, they are so busy. They have more projects than they could staff. So I think there's a reason to be optimistic, but if you all have a better crystal ball, if you find somebody has a good crystal ball, that's fantastic. And the final thing I would say about this is, if you want to be in consulting and the hiring doesn't happen in this fall or this spring, find a role that builds and is additive to your professional portfolio, and be prepared for the consulting job search. And then a year later, you've got everything ready to go. And even networking that you would do at this stage is still really valuable. So consulting firms like to have a stable of candidates. I have a few clients right now. I actually have a client who has an interview with one of the top firms in August. And that individual has been networking with people for about 6 months. And they slowed down the conversation when COVID happened. And then now recently they've picked back up the conversation and then actually put an interview date on the calendar. So I'm encouraged by that. Of course, it's only one example, right? But you know, in closing around this subject, none of you can predict the future. You can't influence the economy, but you can still have the ambition. And that's never, and I'm going to speak very personally, that's never failed me. I mean, I have on a couple of occasions really wanted a job, and it didn't happen for various reasons. And I guess my faith and confidence in myself, and perhaps having really great friends, and just a pinch of, well, I'll be fine, has always brought me to another opportunity that was equally cool. So, again, that's a little bit of my optimistic hat on, but I think it's important to just remember that the door doesn't permanently lock and close, or close and lock. Oh, so the question, consulting, so the question is, do I think consulting as a profession is not going away? Oh, no, absolutely not. Here's maybe a thought for all of you. This is why consulting won't go away. Well, I think there's two reasons. So one, put yourself in the chair of a corporate CEO and ask yourself, when that person is struggling with issues, who do they turn to? They're not going to go to the CFO, because that CFO probably wants their job deep down, or maybe even not deep down. They're not going to go to the board of directors, because the board of directors is who hires and fires a CEO. You might go to your peers. You might have close friends that are also executives, maybe. You probably are going to call up the partner that you work with. And so one of the reasons why consulting, I think, is sustainable is that many times the consulting firm is attached to the CEO. And then secondarily, the reason why consulting will not go away is that businesses have issues. I mean, you all read about them every day. There are crisis situations, there are hidden problems that nobody is aware of. You guys probably have, recently there were a couple of financial institutions that have had big problems, like Wall Street Journal front page problems. One of my closest friends was advising one of those financial institutions at the pretty senior executive level. So no, consulting's not going away. So there's a question about the travel of consulting. Also a fantastic question, lifestyle. I am super excited to think about if this exact situation is the disruptor to the consulting model. I think, again, it will be seen. So some consulting firms have improved their model already, where they have like a 3-2 model, 3 days a week on the road, 2 days in the office. There's a few consulting firms that it's even like 1 week on, 1 week travel. A couple firms don't travel much at all. Firms like LEK travel very little. So this could be a time where it's really allowing firms to think about that. And I'm balanced with it. I mean, I know myself, I traveled a lot, and I think about some of the really, really tough projects that I worked on where having a face-to-face meeting with a client was necessary. What it may allow the firms to do is ad hoc travel. But I think this is a question that is, again, it's a hypothetical discussion. But this is one of the challenges that consulting firms have in their human capital is retention. And many of the times, individuals will depart because of that lifestyle. So, as much as this time has been super difficult for all of us, many of you are students. I hope everyone made through, classes and all of those activities. This has been jarring, but sometimes we need jarring to help us advance. But then sometimes, we learn those lessons and then hindsight or the rear view mirror gets very blurry. So we'll see. We'll see. So I'm going to do this. It's about 7:30. I try to keep these conversations to about 90 minutes. So I'm going to formally wrap us up. I usually am happy to stay for a few more minutes if others have questions or if there's individual questions. But in my conclusion, I just want to thank you all for joining. I hope you found this conversation interesting and insightful and valuable in terms of your present position and thinking about consulting. Again, we'll be back here in a couple of weeks to talk about cases and just, some of the fundamentals of cases. And my hope is to talk a little bit about what's assessed in a case and some of the prep techniques. So again, please join us for that. And have a really nice rest of the week. It was really nice to meet everybody online. All right, so good night.